Good morning, everybody. I see we've got the attendees that are slowly entering the room here. The numbers are creeping up. It's good to see many of you here. It's a huge pleasure for us to be here, and thank you to the London Language Show for having us. We've still got some attendees joining. People are still trickling in. As you're joining, please feel free to take to the chat and tell us where you're joining from. Talk to us, say good morning, in any language you wish. Makes it a bit more fun. This is the London Language Show after all. Where are you joining us from? Good morning, everyone. It's great to have you all here. Great to be here. And yeah, we'll still wait a couple more minutes before we get going, because I see the number of attendees are still climbing, and we've got a first few contributions in the chat. Guten Morgen, auch von uns. We've got someone with Czech as a mother tongue, Portuguese but joining from Germany. Guten Morgen aus Österreich. Hello from Austria. From the University of Bath. Buenos dias desde España. People from Bath. So people joining from the UK, from Italy, Stockholm. Wonderful. A really international audience. That's fantastic. And I still see we've got people joining us from Hungary as well, from Luxembourg, someone else from Bath, Northern Ireland, sorry, London. Fantastic. A lot of people from the UK and from other European countries, Poland. Lovely. Thank you all very much. Someone else from London. Okay, the numbers appear to be stabilizing somewhat. Malta, very nice. Great, well, it's lovely to have you all here. Unfortunately, we can't see you and you can't see each other because this is a webinar format, but we can see your contributions in the chat, so do feel free to use the chat to interact with other participants. If you have any specific questions for us you'd like us to address, I encourage you already, and I will repeat it, to use the Q&A function at the bottom. You should have Q&A. Just pop your questions in there and we'll be able to see those. We might not necessarily see everything that comes in through the chat, so please, any questions you would like us to try and tackle, use the Q&A function. I think you can also view other people's questions and upvote those. So I think we'll, I'm not even going to attempt pronouncing that last one. Good morning to everyone. So yes, welcome. My name's Jenny Taylor, and I'll be moderating this panel, which is called How Did I Get Here? Many Paths Lead to Interpreting a Linguist's Progress to the Booth. I'm an interpreter in the English booth, or the English language unit at the European Commission's Interpreting Service, DG SCIC, and I'm joined this morning by three of my fabulous colleagues, Joanna O'Donnell, also from the European Commission, Sam McGrath from the European Parliament, and Andrew McElroy from the European Court of Justice. And I'm very pleased that they were all able to join us. We've got a couple of other colleagues working hard in the background as well, both from our institutions and from the London Language Show. So thank you also very much for being here and having helped us in preparing this panel. A couple of housekeeping points perhaps before we dive into our discussion. I've already mentioned it, but for those who have only just joined, this is a Zoom webinar format, so we cannot see you. Please use the chat to interact with other participants. If you have any questions, please do use the Q&A function and we will do our best to answer those questions. Before we get going, we do have a quick poll that we've prepared just to sort of get to know our audience a little bit. We already have a general overview of where some of you are from, but I'd like to launch this poll so that you can just tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and we get an idea as to what you do. I'm just going to launch the poll here. So which of the following statements applies to you? I currently work as an interpreter. I am a graduate of languages translation or interpretation, or I'm a student. I'm considering studying languages, none of the above. It would be great to hear who you all are. I see people voting. The votes are coming in. 66, 68, 72, 75% have voted. Wonderful. Keep it coming. As I say, it'd be nice to just get an idea of who our audience is. We are now at almost 90% of people, 91% have participated in the poll. So I think I'm going to close that and share the results with you. So we have a sort of small majority of people who are currently students studying languages translation and or interpreting. So that's good to know. There's a few graduates, a few people also working as interpreters, and some people who haven't or aren't studying yet, but think they might like to do so. So that's useful for us just to know who you are, because the webinar format can be a bit impersonal. It's good to know who's out there. Thank you very much for taking part in that. Now, just to set the scene, I do have a quick video I'd like to share with you, just a minute to sort of get us going. And after that, we'll launch straight into the discussion. I will let my colleagues introduce themselves. And once we've done that, we'll have a bit of a discussion and also be taking questions from you, the audience.
The European institutions work in 24 languages. That way, everyone can play their role in shaping the future of Europe. And they can do it in their own language. EU interpreters work hard to ensure multilingualism. This means that a European citizen speaking Romanian, for example, can be understood in English, and that a Greek speaker can be interpreted into, say, Finnish at the Court of Justice of the European Union, at the European Commission, at the Council of Ministers, and at the European Parliament. EU interpreters strive to provide European citizens with access to debates, access to expertise, and access to justice. Our interpreters are a highly skilled team of professionals who come from many different countries and backgrounds. In this video, you can find out about how to become an interpreter, get inspired by their stories, and see if you'd like to find out more.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about how I found out about interpreting as a job. I was about 16 and I read about it in a career guidebook. Nothing really out of this world. But I just thought it sounded like such an interesting job with a lot of learning, not just about learning languages, but learning about a variety of different subjects, and quite glamorous, getting to travel and meet lots of interesting people. So I decided to go for it.
I think when I was younger, I didn't think that interpreting
Jenny, you need to unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Joanne.
You're very welcome.
I was still seeing the video that kept going. Thank you. So that was the quick video I just wanted to show you by way of an introduction. It also gave you a chance to hear from our colleague Louise, who would have liked to be here this morning, but unfortunately wasn't able to make it in the end. The whole video is available. I believe we'll be posting the link later. And those of you who are interested can go and see all of it. It's about 6 minutes long, but there are also other videos that have been made that you can go and see. So we just heard from our colleague Louise there as to how she heard about interpreting. And now I'd like to pass the floor to my fellow panelists and let them introduce themselves and tell us about how they ended up working as interpreters for the various institutions. So I'll start by passing the floor to Sam, please. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you everyone who's tuned in today to listen to us. I see that there's a couple of people from Bath, which is the university where I studied interpreting. So a special hello to those people, but to everyone who's here from all the different countries in Europe and even further afield. So my name's Sam McGrath, and I work in the English language unit at the European Parliament. And I've been working at the Parliament for a couple of years now. I grew up in a standard monolingual household in Southeast London. I really enjoyed languages at school, and it was kind of a virtuous circle. You enjoy something, so you get good grades. You get good grades, so you enjoy it even more. And then I studied languages at university. I lived in Paris and in Berlin. Then I studied interpreting at the University of Bath. And then I didn't start working for the EU as an interpreter immediately. I initially worked as a freelance translator and interpreter, and then I worked in-house at a European agricultural lobby. And yeah, I think that transition from university to professional life can be a difficult one. You're really trying to get experience, and you're trying to cut your teeth, learn the ropes. But yeah, I think we've all found our way. We've all taken slightly different paths. So I'll hand back to Jenny.
Thank you, Sam, for that brief introduction. Yeah, let's continue with Joanne, please.
Thank you, Jenny, and good morning, everyone. So my name is Joanna O'Donnell, and I also work in the English booth with Jenny at the European Commission. So I went straight into an undergraduate master's in interpreting and translation right out of school. Like Sam, I loved doing languages at school, and I wanted to do something which I thought would be pragmatic and hands-on, as opposed to a more literature history type of focus, which I saw in some of the other language-based degrees. So I completed that course of study, and when I graduated, I was actually only 21, and I had an inkling that I was a bit too young to go straight into a career as an interpreter. Interpreting is not just about knowing languages, it's also about knowing quite a lot about the world and the way the world works, which I would say I didn't at that age. And I also understood from my tutors that to work on the UK market, I would probably need some kind of retour, which I didn't have. And a retour being working into a second language other than English. And because I wanted to stay in the UK at that time, I decided to go for a career in translation. And I worked as a translator for about 6 years, in-house, and then as a self-employed person, starting off in the UK. And then eventually I did actually move to Brussels because I felt that I wanted to live in a place where I could speak the languages that I had learned. And after maybe, about 6 years working as a translator, I felt the kind of the call of the booth of the interpreting. I think I was looking to get back to the immediacy of interpreting. I always loved working as a translator, but there was something about also the interpersonal aspect of interpreting that I wanted to get back to. So I did a top-up course in Brussels, and I was quite fortunate because I was already set up as a self-employed person, and the taxation arrangements and all the rest of it were already in place. So I was able to start working quite quickly. And what really happened for me was a combination of networking and word of mouth. So the tutors who were on the top-up course that I did, when they saw that I was quite good at it, they invited me to volunteer, to do conferences for NGOs, for example, to start out that way. And then I would sit in the booth with someone who would say, "Oh, you have German, I know someone who needs German for their teams." And then slowly it built up like that. Very important to create a positive reputation. And I also joined the AIC, the International Association of Conference Interpreters, as a pre-candidate. And I went to a few networking events where I was able to talk with more senior, more experienced colleagues who gave me advice on the way forward. And so all of that networking was a really important way of getting started on the private market. And then encouraged by one such colleague, after a couple of years, I sat the accreditation test for the joint list of the European institutions. And I started out with 3 C languages, French, German, and Dutch. And there was plenty of work right from the get-go. So I really hit the ground running. And over the years, I've worked with all 3 of the colleagues who you can see in the webinar this morning. So that was 14 years ago now. And I worked on the kind of Benelux section of the AIC market. I worked for the European Patent Office, for the Parliament, for the Commission. And then about halfway through that time, I went to Tenerife and studied Spanish and added Spanish to my portfolio. There's another panel on, I think, interpreting as a kind of lifelong learning experience, and that really is absolutely, I would say, spot on. And I joined the staff at the Commission in January of this year. So that's quite a recent career move for me. And it's been interesting to see the differences between working as a freelancer and working on the staff. I've participated in some training, for example, and in some outreach events such as this one. So that's been quite interesting and gives some variety. So that's a sort of potted CV of mine, and I'm happy to take any questions anybody has. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Yes, just to complete that, the panel you referred to, I think, is tomorrow afternoon at 4:30. So if anyone hasn't got their ticket for that yet, interpreting as a lifelong learning profession, I think we all agree, indeed it is. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Jenny. Hi, everyone. I'm a little bit of an oddity in terms of how you or when you get involved in interpreting, because it was a very late career choice for me. And in fact, one of the reasons why I'm here, I think, is to say that sort of it's never too late to decide to become an interpreter. I had a career, first of all, in the art sector. So I worked basically in museums and contemporary art for about 20 years. And then I was 45, actually, and a friend came to stay one evening who had just passed the accreditation test with the commission. And I didn't even know what the accreditation test was. And I said, oh, to do what? She said, well, to be an interpreter. And I said, oh, an interpreter, you know, that I've always thought that must be such a fascinating career. I've actually often thought that would be a good career for me because I love languages so much. Of course, the problem is, I know I'm much too old. I was 45. And she said to me, well, actually, we have people on the course I've just finished who were in their 50s. And I know people who have accredited in their 50s. So maybe it's not too late. So actually, I'm going to send a call out there to Susanna Sanz, who's a colleague most of us already know in the Spanish booth at SCIC, because she told me I could do it at the age of 45. So at the age of 45, I went to Westminster. I was one of the lucky people at the end of the existence of the Westminster course. I did my 1 year in Westminster, which I still, thinking back on it, I think is a bit tight, a 1 year interpreting course to go from scratch, but I got through it and I accredited immediately after that in Brussels. Now I'd been living in Brussels for about 25 years already, so there wasn't a big move involved in it, but the big move involved for me was a complete career change. So I found myself, rather than being very often the person who was giving a speech or the person who was running a workshop, I found myself sitting in the booth behind the glass, the person who was doing the interpreting. And my point, I think, is to say that if you combine a couple of characteristics, I think it's an absolutely fabulous career. I had the passion for languages. I had some languages in my pocket as a practical undertaking because I'd worked in various European countries. I didn't study languages as an academic subject, but I'd worked in languages. I'd lived in Italy for a few years. I'd spent a long time in Germany. And when I started interpreting, I found immediately that the combination of independence, freedom, and that little bit of adrenaline stress that we all get when we're working in the booth was perfect for me. I absolutely loved it. I loved the fact that I was doing something. I sometimes say to people, it's a bit like being a linguistic plumber. It was something I knew I could do. Somebody needed me. I did the job, they paid me for it, and I went home and I forgot about it. And that is still, for me, one of the great advantages of this as a job. It's dynamic, it's exciting, great colleagues, and I get to use my languages every day. Just to give you 5 minutes on where I actually got to eventually. So I started as a freelancer. I worked at the European Parliament on staff as a temporary staff member for a couple of years. Then I went back to freelancing for 2 or 3 years. And then 3 years ago, I had my first gig at the European Court of Justice. And it's an odd thing to say, but I like to say it. People think of the European Court of Justice as being very dry and very technical. But for me, it's been an absolute eye-opener and a really enjoyable and exciting place to work. And as a final point, I might say, it's interesting how I think we all find circles close. When I went to university, I studied law. I studied law in Paris, and it was a great experience. I loved it. but I knew I was never going to be a lawyer for lots of reasons. But isn't it funny, here I now find myself 30 years later in a legal environment interpreting lawyers. And I'd really encourage anyone out there who is thinking mid-career or about a career change, not to dismiss the interpreting translation spectrum, because, you know, if you've got languages, there's a need for you. So encourage to everyone out there who's not 18 and starting off on their linguistic careers.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's yeah, really interesting to hear from all three of you, sort of how you came to interpreting at various stages. Joanne, as you said, sort of studying it, you know, fairly early, but not feeling ready. Andrew coming at it fairly late, and Sam also sort of out of university, finding your way on the interpreting market. So from what I've heard from you, it sounds like, you know, to be an interpreter, one does need the language skills, but does one necessarily have to have studied languages to become an interpreter? I mean, Andrew's already half answered that question, saying you didn't, right? You just picked up your languages working abroad. I would also perhaps ask, does one have to have studied interpreting to be an interpreter? I mean, we all did, but do we know of colleagues who perhaps didn't?
Could I answer that, Jenny, or attempt to anyway? I'm certainly aware of at least one colleague who I personally think is excellent, who didn't study interpreting and who sort of fell into it because she had excellent language skills and was working for a big association and ended up interpreting between people in meetings, at conferences, because she could do it. And sort of discovered that she had a skill for this, and then began to work in the booth and accumulated a wealth of experience. I would say I think that's quite an unusual route. I'm only aware of maybe one or two people who've done it like that, but I certainly don't think it's impossible.
And also, Jenny, I might just come in and say, of course, when you do an interpreting course, you're not just learning the basic techniques of interpreting, you're also learning a little bit, I think, about the psychological environment in which interpreters work. And as we all know, and I think I saw people smiling when I said, you know, but the adrenaline or the stress of being in the booth, it can at times be quite a stressful job. And how you manage that stress is also something that I think you learn from your fellow students and from your teachers when you go through an interpreting course. So I'm a big fan of what they teach you on courses.
Would you like to add anything, Sam?
I would just agree. There are a few colleagues who haven't gone down the path of studying interpreting at university. Yeah, they're few and far between. I think they're quite special people because I think it is quite important to learn the different techniques of simultaneous and consecutive. And I know we don't just want to look at interpreting from an institutional, from an EU perspective, but if you do want to work for the EU, then at the accreditation test, you sit examinations in consecutive and in simultaneous, and you might well be expected to work in both of those modes. So I think to really get to grips with consec and with simultaneous, most people will study them in an academic setting, but of course doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I would agree that you learn a lot on interpreting courses that is invaluable later on when you start out in the profession. Also, Joanne mentioned the sort of networking aspect, and I find that your fellow students and also your teachers on interpreting courses can be really valuable sources as well of contacts and ideas as to how you might start out working. I do see a question in the Q&A from Catherine specifically on this. Can you sit the UN and EU interpreting tests without having a master's formal qualification in interpreting, or is having an interpreting master's a PGDIP a requirement for sitting the UN and EU tests? I can't speak for the UN tests, unfortunately. I'm not sure what exactly their requirements are, but I know that in order to even be invited to an EU test, you have to have either an interpreting qualification, so an interpreting degree, or I think it's about 4 years of experience as working as an interpreter that you have to be able to prove somehow. So if you were fortunate enough to, without having studied interpreting, to have been employed by someone as an interpreter, and you can prove that work experience, you may not need the degree. But I think in order to even be invited to a test, you have to prove that you have either the training or the necessary experience.
And
Andrew?
maybe just to say, Jenny, of course, it also shortcuts. I mean, you can batter down the doors and say, look, these are all the people I've worked with as an interpreter. But if you've got either your PG Dip or you've got your master's, that information is sent to the commission. It's sent to the interpreting body. So they know the names of the people who have gone through. And in fact, very often, people like Joanna, or yourself, Jenny, or Sam will have gone to these universities and will have met the students. So in a way, I think if your decision is now, I'm not an interpreter and I want to be an interpreter, my advice is get yourself the education to do it, because it's simply quicker and therefore easier.
Yes, very, very good point. On the topic of interpreting courses, I saw there was another question in the Q&A about whether one can train as an interpreter part-time. Are there many part-time interpreters? I believe you can train part-time as an interpreter, but that would depend on the course you do. I don't know if any of my fellow panelists have more information on part-time courses. I believe it is possible, but you would want to look at each specific course and see whether that is an option that they can offer you. But I do feel like I know of some colleagues who did it part-time whilst also having another job or having families. It is a very stress. I see Andrew looking a little less sure about that. I think from people I've spoken to, my own experience and colleagues, if you can just take the year to do it and do it well, that's probably what my recommendation would be. Otherwise, you risk getting distracted, it risks being drawn out, and it is quite an intense course to be doing. So it's quite nice to be able to dedicate your full attention to it. But of course, if that's not an option for you due to your personal circumstances, then I think there are ways of doing it part-time. And then the second part of that question, are there many part-time interpreters? I would say yes, a lot of freelance interpreters only work part-time in the booth and do a huge variety of other things in their spare time. Would anyone like to come in on either of those aspects of that question?
Well, I'm happy to just say quickly that when I started, my intention was only to work maximum maybe 2 days a week as an interpreter and then to carry on with other projects. But actually, I enjoyed it so much that it pretty much turned into a full-time job, especially based in Brussels and especially in the English booth. But if you've got other stuff you want to do, interpreting is a very reasonably flexible way to earn money, and you can fit stuff around it.
Can I just say, sorry, Joanne.
Go ahead, Sam.
I'll just say that, of course, at the beginning of their careers, a lot of interpreters will also work as translators. They will also work as language teachers. But then I've met colleagues who combine interpreting with much more kind of exotic activities. I think there's a woman at the Commission who trains horses. I know of other interpreters, freelance interpreters, who also write novels or who are trained psychologists. So that's one of the advantages of being particularly a freelance interpreter. You can divide up your time as you see fit. You're offered contracts and for a specific day. So if you want to work on that day, you can accept it. If you're busy with other activities, you're free to say no to it.
Yeah, Joanne.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. There were two things I wanted to say. One thing was about whether or not to do a course, and I would just back up that I think it's also a very good idea, not least because there can be a lot of solidarity amongst fellow students. And a lot of the time when I added Spanish and I went to Tenerife, there was a high level of motivation and people set up practice groups, and there were additional opportunities to keep on practicing and learning, which I think might be quite difficult if you're doing it in isolation. So that's really a support network which is there. And then when it comes to the sort of part-time aspect of the thing, I think varies depending on whether you're quite new or quite experienced. I think quite experienced colleagues can probably afford to be out of the booth for a longer period of time without feeling every time they go back in, you know, it's quite stressful and it's all very, very new. So there's definitely scope for combining it. Like as Sam said, I know someone who's a dancer, for example, and also a part-time interpreter. And I started out as a translator, and then I did mostly translation and a little bit of interpreting, then sort of half and half, and then it went the other way. And what I would say about translation or any other language-based type of activity that is in conjunction with the interpreting, and I couldn't make ends meet with the interpreting to start with, is that it supports the interpreting. So through the translation, I was making all of those links in the brain. How am I saying this in English? What about this word? And some of those things stood me in excellent stead. And I had some of those reflexes ready when I then went into the booth. And to start with, I was maybe only in the booth 2 days a month. So the gap was quite big. And, you know, there's a kind of a fear of being a bit rusty. But because I was in another language-based career at the same time, it really helped to keep the languages alive.
Thank you, Joanne. Yes, I think what you've all said is absolutely true. People can do all sorts of other things while also being interpreters. I would perhaps add that if you are combining various activities, it's good if you can to have flexibility in how you structure your day. So, you know, if you're working 2.5 or 3 days in an office and it has to be those 2.5, 3 days, that could be quite limiting, I think, in terms of your ability to accept interpreting assignments. Whereas translation is very nice to combine because you can fit your translation assignments around your interpreting job offers. You know, I know someone who's a yoga teacher as well. So, you know, that's something you can do in the evenings after, you know, you're not likely to be assigned to the booth in the evenings. So I think people who are starting out as interpreters and trying to get work, it is important to have a certain degree of flexibility with your other activities so that you can accept interpreting assignments as and when they come in, because you do have the freedom to accept or not accept an offer. But obviously in the beginning, you really want to try to accept as many offers as you can just to build your experience. I might go back to the Q&A because I feel there's quite a few questions that have come in now. There's a question here from Catherine again asking, is it important to specialize in a particular area as a working interpreter, a particular niche area, or is it better to know some information for all fields of interest? Andrew?
I have a very clear position in this, and I work in the Court of Justice where I'm meant to know about legal stuff. As an interpreter, my job has been built about knowing a little bit about tons of stuff. Don't ask me to go into detail, but if you want a quick overview of something, I can probably bring something off the top of my head. I think that's true. What do my colleagues think?
I see Joanne nodding. Would you like to come in?
I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I would say that to a certain extent, a prerequisite for enjoying this job is being willing to not to want to go into lots of depth and understand absolutely all the ins and outs of things. That is a losing battle because, you know, we will be in one thing one day, another thing the next day. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some basic points of jargon. For example, I'm working at the European Commission. There's quite a lot of Commission or EU jargon, which of course I know. But this afternoon I'm in something about competitiveness. Next week I'll be in something about, dare I say it, Brexit, the B word. Then it'll be something else, sorry. Then it'll be something else. So there has to be actually an ability to adapt quite quickly and to absorb a fair amount of vocab perhaps, and then let it go. And some of it will stay for the next time and some of it won't, and you'll have to go through that process again. So I think that's absolutely right.
Sam?
I agree. You have to be a generalist. You can have your favorite subjects, and I know that at the Commission, for instance, you can volunteer for meetings that you find particularly interesting. So if there's a subject that you feel particularly passionate or interested about, you can ask to be put in that meeting. You might not always be put in it because, you know, there are so many different meetings and so many demands on your time. But I personally started out working in agriculture, and I was specialized in that, and that's helped me. That's put me in good stead, because there's still a lot of talk about agriculture within the EU as a whole. I think 40% of the overall budget goes on agricultural spending. I'd also completely agree with Joanne that if you're aiming for the EU, it's good to have good knowledge of how the EU works, what the different institutions do, a bit about their histories, the personalities, the people. All that can be really, really, really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I've got a couple of questions here about languages, and just to keep the interaction with the audience going a bit, we do have 2 more poll questions that I'd like to put to you. So let me see if I can make this work. This is just for you to, let us know what you think. What do you think is the average number of passive languages among staff interpreters in the English booth at the European Commission? I had to limit it in that way because that's the booth I know best. Do people have 2 passive languages, 3, 4, 5? I see the votes are coming in, so I'll just let that go for a little while. In the meantime, perhaps I can just answer one of the questions that came in, which was, do you have to have French as a passive language to work in the EU? And I would say yes. I don't know if my colleagues would agree. I do know a few colleagues who were accredited with languages other than French, but they were encouraged to, as soon as humanly possible, please add French as their next language. They were not allowed to or not encouraged to add any languages other than French until they had French under their belts. And I think that French is indeed the only language that in the English booth every single member of staff has in their combination. Andrew?
Just say very quickly, the Court of Justice, because French is our working language, not English, you have to have French in order to be an interpreter here.
Yeah. Anyone else on that? The question of French.
I would say that French is an important language in the EU. It used to be the lingua franca, but it isn't anymore. You can still be accredited, and you can still work at the EU without French, but I think you would definitely need German and Spanish, German and Italian, and then in the long term it would probably be in your interest to learn French. But yeah, that initial step of the accreditation test, I don't think it is a prerequisite. Very useful language, my favorite, if I'm allowed to say that.
I think you're allowed to say that. I'm going to end this poll now because it looks like everyone has voted, or everyone who's going to vote has voted. So we've got, most people think it's about 3. The correct answer is actually 4. So at the European Commission in the English booth, everyone has an average of 4 languages, with people who were fairly early on in their careers tending to have fewer, 2 or 3. And then people who have been working for 25, 30 years and have had the opportunity to add more languages, pushing up to 5 or 6. I think there might even be a colleague with up to 7 languages. So yes, the average number of languages is 4. And then I think there was a question linked to the question of French, which is, do you have to have a retour language? And I'm really glad you asked this question, because my final poll is precisely that. Again, what percentage of staff interpreters in the English booth at the European Commission, again, the booth I know best, work into a retour language? What would you guess? Let that poll run for a minute or so. While we're on it, do any of my panelists have a retour language? I don't think we've actually introduced ourselves with our language combinations.
I don't anymore, Jenny, but I did start out with the one, so I can mention it briefly if you like.
Go ahead, yes, please.
When I started out on the kind of the volunteering, or right at the very start, I did do maybe about 10 conferences where I worked biactively between English and French, and there were no other languages in the meeting, just the 2. And then I really felt I was at a crossroads, and when I went to one of these IEC networking events, I put the question to some more experienced colleagues and said I could continue down this path, in which case I felt I wanted to train properly in the retour. I mean, my spoken French was excellent, I was speaking it every day, but I felt I wanted to train. Or should I beef up the number of passive languages that I had and moved more into a more kind of EU type of market. And it was really a question of which market. The bilingual one was more international. The larger number of passive language was more European. And it was also for me personally a question of mental strain. I found that when I did the biactive, I was working most of the time into French, which was my B language, obviously, and I really did find it very tiring. So I made the choice to, you know, train more in the Dutch, work on the Spanish, and just keep one A. And that's worked out quite well for me. But I think it depends a little bit on your situation.
Yes, absolutely. Sam?
Yes, I had a similar experience to Joanne, where on the private market, I sometimes worked into French, and she's completely right. Often a lot of the conference might be in English, and then you end up working 90% of the time into your B language, which is extremely tiring. And I would say that the standards for a retour language are high, but at the European institutions, they're extremely high. So I think, if I'm honest with myself, the French that I used on the private market wouldn't be good enough for an institutional level. So that's why at the European Parliament, I just work from my passive languages always into English. So I work from French, German, Spanish, and Portuguese always into English, my mother tongue. And yeah, I think retour is used more frequently in the Central and Eastern European booths, where we don't have those languages in our combinations as frequently. So there aren't many people, for instance, in the English booth at the European Parliament who have Polish, for instance, or Czech. So there we rely on our Czech or Polish colleagues to provide a retour. So they'll be working into English or French or German, for instance.
Yes, I think you're quite right there. And as a general rule of thumb, I tend to say that if you work in one of the smaller language booths, as we call them, such as the Polish booth, the Czech booth, the Lithuanian, Maltese booth, if one of those is your mother tongue, it makes an awful lot of sense to have a retour preferably into English or French, because that will be extremely useful. Whereas if you're an interpreter in a larger language booth, the English, German, French, Spanish, Italian booth, it tends to be more useful. You tend to be more useful in meetings with more passive languages and working from a larger number of other languages back into your mother tongue, because then you can also be used as a relay for people who don't have, say Portuguese. Sam, you work with Portuguese. That's not a terribly common language, especially not in some of the Eastern European booths. And so you could be used as a relay, because a lot of people will understand English. So that's sort of a general rule of thumb on retours. Speaking of retours, I think we've had everyone who's going to take part in the poll has taken part. So I'll just close that, share the results with you. And it appears that, yes, people have tended to perhaps overestimate the number of retourists in our booth. The actual number is 18%. So that just goes to show that in order to work in the English booth at the European Commission, certainly, it really is not a prerequisite to have a retour. Joanna's alluded a little bit to other markets. If you're not aiming at an institutional market, obviously the four of us are very much focused on the European institutions. It's where we work, but there are many other interpreting markets out there. And for those, a retour may well be much more useful. And also it depends, of course, on your mother tongue. We're, again, all four of us coming at it from a very Anglophone mother tongue perspective. But if your mother tongue is a completely different language, a retour might make a lot more sense. Would anyone else? Andrew?
Just something very, very briefly with that. There was a question about public service interpreting. Of course, public service interpreters very often have to work with retour, and it's an extraordinary challenging area of interpreting. We actually have a conference once a year here in the court where public service interpreters who work inside national courts come to the court here, and we work with them for a few days to look at the challenges. And I think they do an extraordinary job. And I'd say a huge number of those interpreters have retours, because obviously they're dealing with people at the very cold face of the legal profession in courts, and they play an absolutely essential role. And I think it's something that we in the court have come to appreciate much more, how difficult that job is and how essential it is as part of the legal process. So retour on the private market. In the court, we only have retours for the very small booths, so Lithuanian, Estonian, either into English or French. Otherwise, the standard in the court is into your mother tongue only.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I think that preempts one of the questions in the Q&A as well, which is, do you have to be able to work back into French as an English booth interpreter at the Court of Justice? And the answer is clearly no. Okay, I'm just taking another look through the Q&A questions here. There's a few, there's one that's sort of framed as a bit of a personal question, but perhaps we can take it anyway. How do you combine your personal life together with your career? And perhaps also we could tie in with that, do you travel a lot for the job now after COVID? Would anyone like to take either of those?
I'll make one very brief comment and then Sam or Joanne can take over, because actually one of the reasons why I enjoy working at the court is I don't travel. When I worked both in the Parliament, especially in the Parliament, there was a great deal of travel. And so even 10 years ago, that was still a lot of fun and I enjoyed it. But at a certain moment, you think I've kind of had enough, you know, I don't want to do any more 24-hour flights in order to spend an hour or two somewhere foreign. So I'm happy not traveling. You don't travel with the court because all the work takes place in Luxembourg. And in terms of combining family life and interpreting, I think it's perhaps at the moment even more doable than for lots of other professions. COVID has maybe changed that a little bit, because I know that all of us have had to deal with working in different environments. So for example, I do more work from home than I used to because of COVID. So in fact, that's made the balancing family life and professional life even easier. But I've never found any difficulty in getting a proper balance between those two.
I'll just jump in. I think one of the hallmarks of the European Parliament and working there is the amount of travel that you have to commit to. As most people know, the European Parliament has 2 seats, one in Brussels and the other in Strasbourg. So before the COVID pandemic hit, all interpreters working at the Parliament would travel to Strasbourg on a monthly basis. We know we don't do that right now. It's not clear whether we're going to return to Strasbourg. The MEPs have, but currently we interpret the plenaries meetings from Brussels. MEPs also do a lot of fact-finding missions, electoral observation missions, and other kinds of travel, and they often need us. For instance, last week, I went with the European Parliament's Beating Cancer Committee to Geneva, to the WHO, and then the day after we traveled to Lyon to meet with oncologists from one of France's leading cancer hospitals. And so that was, I mean, that's really interesting. You feel so privileged to get an insight into a world that you might normally know nothing about. That it can be difficult to balance all the travel with your personal life. You have to be very organized, and yeah. But if you're young and you enjoy traveling, then the Parliament can be a really great place to work in that respect.
I wonder if I could just come in quickly on this point. I mean, COVID reduced the amount of travel for everyone, full stop, no matter what job or personal situation we were in. So that certainly happened. And I would say that the travel is slowly coming back again. It's increasing a little bit. I have a young family, and certainly there are times in this job when I finish quite late, or when my program changes at the last minute. And I will say it is necessary to be able to catch that. So to have something in place to make that possible. The European Commission is an excellent employer, and there are plenty of opportunities to combine work and family life well. But yeah, the job in and of itself sometimes involves maybe nighttime sessions or a slightly unusual working hours as opposed to a more traditional office job.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree that yes, the extent to which you travel very much depends on the institution for which you work. And as a freelance, you have more flexibility to decide how much travel you wish to accept and how much you wish to not accept. Of course, we have been traveling a lot less since the start of the COVID pandemic, but it is certainly for the European Commission starting up again. There's various audit missions that I think are going back into the member countries, as well as various missions, we call them sort of business trips, to interpret for the presidencies of the Council of Ministers. So the travel is slowly coming back. But I'd say that certainly at the Commission it is fairly easy to combine family life. I also have a young family with working as an interpreter. I've certainly found that. And on sort of COVID and how that has changed our way of working, I would perhaps also just refer you to the panel taking place this afternoon at 3:45, which is the New Technologies panel. So if you haven't signed up for that one yet, please do join us for the New Technologies panel, where we will be talking more about remote interpreting, distance interpreting, and the way in which COVID has had an impact on our profession and the technological side of that. I'm going back to the questions now. There's another one about French. Do you have to supply evidence of having French as a passive language when you apply for the accreditation test? I don't believe you do. You have to have 2 languages. However, on the website, which we'll refer you to at the end of this webinar, there, I believe, is an overview as to priority languages, and French is almost definitely among those. If you don't have French, you can still apply for the test with your existing languages, but if the number of test slots is limited and you may not get priority, you may not immediately get invited if you don't have French, and French is being treated as more of a priority language. But certainly you don't have to prove that you have French when you apply for the accreditation test.
Jenny, sorry, I don't
yes,
want to
Joanne,
interrupt
go
you.
ahead.
I just, because I saw a wee while ago that there was a question on the Q&A about courses, about which courses are available. And I just wanted to give a wee list, which might not be exhaustive, but there is information on the Europa website. So there are courses in Bath, Galway, Heriot-Watt, Leeds, La Laguna, Geneva, and the list goes on. There are a fair few courses available, and you can definitely look that up on the Europa website.
Thank you, Joanne. If you happen to have that link available, maybe you could just pop it in the chat for everyone. That was very useful.
There's a question about how we deal with stress. Do we
yes.
want to? Do we want to field that? Are we giving away the tricks of the trade?
Well, I know if anyone's got any tricks of the trade, I'd be very glad to have them. So tell me, Joanne, what do you do?
I don't actually know is the absolutely honest answer. It's an excellent question because there is inevitably stress involved. I think that, yeah, if anybody who's thinking of working as an interpreter, you definitely have to be at least comfortable with, and maybe even sometimes enjoy, the slight performance aspect. There is an audience, there is scrutiny, you are under pressure. If you don't like those kind of things, it's not going to work out because, you know, it does create stress. I think maybe for me, there are 2 things. I try to remember that fundamentally it's about communication, and I'm trying to help people to understand one another. It's not really about me, it's about them, and to keep the focus on that service that I'm providing, as opposed to thinking about all the scrutiny that I'm under. And possibly something else which I find quite helpful is certainly doing lots of prep especially if it's a new
Yes.
topic, you come in feeling that you've already done as much as you could in advance. And understanding, so prep such as glossary work or reading documents, but also just understanding the context, being able to kind of read a room or read a person. Is this person from a left-wing political party? Are they likely to have said they were in favour of a minimum wage or not? I didn't quite, the sound, there was a blip in the sound, but I've got an idea of who I'm dealing with and what kind of context I'm in. So anything that you can do before you come into the booth, which will bolster your confidence and give you a sense that you have some knowledge of what's going on, will help.
I agree with that, Joanna. And I also think that, to be honest, you deal with stress partly by being healthy and happy outside of the booth. In other words, I do yoga and I meditate, and that's an important part of me staying healthy and happy anyway. And I find that it's useful for me when I go into the booth. The other thing I would say is that it's a profession for people with reasonably broad shoulders, in the sense that all of us get it wrong. All of us make mistakes. All of us say the wrong term at the wrong place, or we make the wrong reference at one stage or another. And you just have to kind of suck it up and move on. If you're somebody who goes home and spends 2 hours, I don't know, in crisis mode because you mentioned the wrong fish, which, as you know, every part of Spain has a different word for the same fish, you're just going to get it wrong. So there's no point beating yourself up. I think having a sense of perspective is the best way to control stress. I don't know if Sam agrees with that.
I completely subscribe to what you've said, Andrew, and to what Joanne said. I would say that at the beginning of your career, it's completely normal to be nervous. Actually, I think it's normal to be a bit nervous throughout your career, especially if you're interpreting someone famous or someone who's who's quite politically important. I also think that nerves, you can harness your nerves, and kind of keeps you on your toes. I really like tennis, and a lot of tennis players say that they know when they should retire because they don't feel nervous before a match anymore. So actually, I kind of feel a bit comforted by the fact that I feel a bit nervous before a meeting, because it shows that I'm anxious to do well, to help the participants communicate, and to do my best.
And also just a very quick point, Jenny, because I might lose it, which is, I think all of us keep the training going in a way. I mean, we all do ongoing training in our jobs. I attend exercises all the time. I have language training on a weekly basis. It's not as if you get into the job and there you are, it's finished. You have to keep up to speed. And that very act of keeping up to speed, I think, helps to give you more sense of confidence in what you do. So it's not a kind of, I've done the training, I've got accredited, I'm in the booth and it's over. You're going to not only be adding languages, you're going to be improving the ones you've got. Even the ones you've had for the longest period of time, you need to get better at them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. And I can only encourage people to attend the session tomorrow afternoon at 4:30 on interpreting as a lifelong learning profession. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to just share a screen with a QR code to a variety of links that people can scan and see all the links. There's also been a few posted in the chat. And maybe we can just wrap up by me asking each of you to perhaps name, 3 character traits or particular skills that you think would make a good interpreter. Can I ask you to kick off, Andrew? You look like you're thinking.
Okay, this doesn't apply to everyone, but I would say curious about the world outside. I would say resilient. You can kind of take the knocks a little bit. And I would say enthusiastic. I think everyone that I know as an interpreter has got a bit of enthusiasm bubbling up. They're really interested in people, languages, information. So yeah, that's what I'd say to get us going.
Yeah, Joanne?
Yeah, I hate to repeat, but curiosity is my top one as well. Curiosity about languages, people, cultures, the world, the way things work. It's stress resilience also. And then I would say an ability, as I said before, to sort of absorb things, then let them go. to work with someone one day and then never, not for another year, and also to share a very small space with someone. That's not 3, but then I'm a linguist, not a mathematician. To be able to share a small space with someone all day long is also a bit of a skill.
Indeed, thank you. Sam, to wrap up.
Yes, I think we're curious. Maybe I'll use a different word and say sometimes we're a bit nosy. We want to be involved, know what's going on, but we always abide by professional secrecy. So we keep the secrets of what we've heard in the meeting. I think we really care about the details. We're really interested in the sense of details. And then I think good interpreters can zoom in on the small things, and then they can zoom back out and see the bigger picture. So we can do kind of the micro details, but then the macro of the larger landscape.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope everyone's had a chance to scan that QR code if they wanted to. Otherwise, if you just go to the Interpreting for Europe website, you'll find a lot of the information that we've covered during this webinar there. I'll stop sharing my screen just so that I can see the panelists as we say goodbye, because this is the end of our allotted time. There were a couple of questions we weren't able to answer, unfortunately, but I hope we have been able to cover most of the things that the audience was interested in hearing about. It's certainly been a lot of fun for me to have this conversation with my panelists. Thank you all, and good luck to everyone who's considering going down the path of interpreting. Remember, it's never too late. Take setbacks in your stride, be curious and resilient. And if you have a love of languages and you think you'd make a good interpreter, please do, yes, check out the resources, inquire about courses. And all the best with that, and have a great rest of the London Language Show, everyone.
And thank you to you, Jenny, for moderating. You were wonderful.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, colleagues.
Yes,
Thank you,
Jenny. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.